Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the globe. Japan's February the 8th snap election has delivered a landslide victory for Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi and the Liberal Democratic Party, securing a rare two-thirds supermajority in the lower house. Markets initially cheered the result, but questions are emerging over fiscal sustainability, defense expansion and Japan's China policy. As Tokyo signals a more assertive role in the Indo-Pacific, the implications extend far beyond Japan's borders. Joining us now to discuss this is Craig Peacock, a chief advisor at Kujaku Japan Advisory and former Western Australian Commissioner for Japan. He has decades of experience working at the intersection of Japan's economy, politics and international partnerships. Today he joins us to discuss Japan's election result, its economic and security direction and what this means for the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you very much, Craig, for joining us here on NewsX World. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Let's get straight into this. Japan's February the 8th election delivered a historic landslide for Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi and the Liberal Democratic Party, giving her a rare two-thirds supermajority in the lower house. For a global audience, what does this mandate mean, not just for Japan domestically, but for its role in the Indo-Pacific region?
Yes, well, I think the result is political permission for speed. Domestically, a two-thirds lower house supermajority lets the Prime Minister move beyond the day-to-day coalition bargaining and allows her to push a clear program on what cost of living should be, growth and national security. Regionally, I think it signals a more confident Japan that's prepared to shoulder more of the burden in its alliances, particularly with the US, not replacing the US, but becoming a more viable partner to the US, I think. So I think you can expect to see more proactive diplomacy, more security cooperation with the like-minded partners, and a stronger posture on economic security. You know, it's been a while since we've had a supermajority in Japan, and her winning 316 seats of the 465 seat diet is very significant. I think it's a mandate for decisiveness, and that it will change Japan's pace. It's signaling that Japan is ready, is reliable, and definitely it signals that Japan is harder to coerce.
And early market reactions to Takaichi's victory were positive, but there are growing concerns about her ambitious fiscal agenda, including suspension of the food consumption tax and expansive government spending. From your perspective, how might Japan's fiscal direction under Takaichi affect investor confidence and economic stability?
That's a very interesting question. I think, you know, markets tend to like clarity and stability. And that's when you see a positive reaction, as we've seen in the last week. But investor confidence in Japan always comes down to one very, very important question, and that's growth versus debt. A 2-year suspension of the food tax and a large stimulus package is going to support households, and it will, I think, give Japanese people better sentiment in the short term. But if the funding looks like it's vague or that it doesn't have a backbone, then the bond markets will sense some kind of fiscal drift. And then that will affect the Japanese government bonds, and it will affect the yen, of course. So the key to this is probably credibility. If the Prime Minister pairs stimulus in a convincing medium-term plan, well, then I think investors will be able to live with it. So, you know, stability, of course, becoming part of the makeup is bullish. Unfunded promises are probably not going to be. And so I think the Prime Minister can spend, but she has to explain it.
And Takaichi has signalled a willingness to increase defence spending towards 2% of GDP, expand Japan's military footprint and work closely with the United States. How significant is this strategic shift for the US-Japan alliance, and what does it mean for countering China in the region?
Another good question. It's significant because it normalizes Japan as a higher capacity security partner, I feel. And then, in some budget settings and even surpassing 2%, it shifts Japan from being a constrained contributor to a more operationally useful ally for the US and for the other allies. So for Washington, that's burden sharing, I guess. And that's very important for them. For Tokyo, it's deterrence. For China, it probably raises the cost of the coercion and makes it less symbolic and more integrated. I think Japan will still frame this as defensive and rules-based. So this is Japan moving from checkbook security to capability security, I think.
Beijing has been vocal in its criticism of Takaichi's nationalist and defence-oriented agenda, particularly regarding Taiwan, of course. Given the resilience of Japanese policy for public support for her stance, how might this reshape Tokyo-Beijing relations and broader regional stability?
The Tokyo-Beijing relationship is going to become more openly competitive, I feel. China is going to test Japan, and it will do that through rhetoric, through economic signaling, and the usual sort of grey zone pressure that they put on. But I think Japan's public mood has hardened on the coercion that China undertakes. And Takaichi has done very well to read that very well. The risk is miscalculation on her part, I think. Sharper signaling can stabilise some deterrence, but it can also raise the temperature if either side overplays the matter. The best outcome, I think, would be managed friction, if I could say that. Japan keeps channeling while strengthening the deterrence measures and alongside the US and the partners. And of course, the worst outcome, of this could be crisis politics driving escalation. So I would expect managed friction, not really a reset, but the deterrence can prevent conflict, I think, and also if it's misread, it can provoke something worse. But I think we're going to see managed friction.
And polls suggest unusually high approval for Takaichi among younger voters, a demographic that historically leaned elsewhere. How did her campaign resonate with younger Japanese, and what might that mean for her political longevity and agenda?
That's an interesting point because in the last 30 years in Japan, I have seen a quite apathetic younger generation. The younger support, I think, appears less about ideology and more about economic security and the authenticity that they feel. Younger voters here in Japan now are living in a squeeze. Prices are up, wages are lagging. They're very anxious about their future. She campaigned on a very decisive policy of being a doer. With viable cost of living measures like the food tax proposal. So she also communicates in a more direct modern way than Japan's traditional political style, especially since former Prime Minister Abe. In the interim between then and her prime ministership, we've seen a less direct style of prime ministership. So I think that cuts through cynicism with young people. For longevity, that's of course very, very valuable, but it does come with conditions. And if living standards don't improve, younger voters can swing away very quickly. So I feel the young are not voting towards the right, they're voting towards relief.
Takaichi has also emphasised reducing dependence on China-centric supply chains and boosting Japan's technological strength. How realistic is this strategy, and what opportunities or risks does it present for Japanese industry and international partners?
Well, I think it's very important to frame this as de-risking, not decoupling. Japan can't and won't sever economic ties with China overnight. It's just not possible. Where it can reduce single point dependencies, for example, in critical minerals, advanced components, pharmaceuticals, batteries, and other key manufacturing inputs that they have. The opportunity is, I feel, stronger resilience and a push into high-value tech. The risk, of course, in that is cost. Diversification can be expensive. If you want to diversify your supply chains, over a single supply chain, well, that's going to be expensive. And if it's done clumsily, it can hurt the competitiveness that Japan enjoys in many of those industries. The international partners who bring trusted supply, capital and technology will find openings, but Japan will demand reliability in the long term and commitment, of course, as they always do. So it's not a leave China, it's don't be a hostage to one supplier.
And finally, the election result signals a more assertive Japan on defence, economic security and regional strategy. Do you see this moment as Japan stepping into a more defined leadership role in the Indo-Pacific, or as a strategic shift that could heighten tensions with key neighbours, particularly, of course, China?
I believe both dynamics can be true at once. Japan stepping into a clearer leadership role on defence, economic security and regional security, that will inherently create friction with the neighbours who obviously prefer a quieter Japan. The real question is how Japan uses the new power that it seems to have. If it stays anchored to the alliance in coordination and international law and practical economic resilience, then it strengthens stability. If the rhetoric outpaces the strategy, it could heighten tensions, most significantly with China, of course. So right now, I think the mandate suggests that Japan will be more assertive, but they won't be reckless. They never have been. I think you'll see definitely stronger leadership, and of course the Prime Minister is already displaying that. But the aim is stability through deterrence, I think.
Craig Peacock, thank you very much for sharing your insights here on Focal Length. It's a pleasure to talk to you.